The moment Unteroffizier Wolfgang Dorsch crossed into the American compound at Camp Opelika, Alabama, he stopped walking. July 1943. The Alabama heat pressed down like a furnace, but that wasn't what paralyzed him. Through the chain-link fence he could see American guards drinking bottles of Coca-Cola. Ice-cold bottles, condensation beating on dark glass, pulled from a humming electric cooler. The same Coca-Cola that had vanished from German shops in 1939. The same luxury drink that Wehrmacht propaganda claimed the decadent Americans could no longer afford to produce, their factories converted to desperate war production. Dorsch had surrendered in Tunisia 5 weeks earlier, convinced he was entering captivity under a nation stretched to its breaking point. The bottle cap hitting concrete made a sound like a tiny bell. Behind Dorsch, 300 other men from the Afrika Korps filed through the gates. Veterans of Rommel's desert campaign, they'd been captured in the collapse of May 1943, when 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in North Africa. These were men who'd eaten sawdust extended bread in the final weeks, who'd counted their last 60 rounds of ammunition like a miser counts coins, who'd watched their vehicles sputter dry, abandoned in the sand, while American Sherman tanks rolled past in endless columns. They knew the mathematics of defeat: 200 grams of bread per day, 15 rounds per rifle, 1 liter of fuel per vehicle per day, if lucky. They thought they understood scarcity. The mess hall at Camp Opelika changed everything. Obergefreiter Hans Richter would later write to his wife, in letters the Americans allowed him to send twice monthly, that he didn't believe his eyes. White bread, actual white bread, stacked in pyramids, butter in small perfect pats, orange juice in glass pitchers, coffee with real cream, and meat, not horse, not mysterious compressed rations, but identifiable chicken, beef, pork, the kind of meat German civilians hadn't seen since 1941. The portions that first evening weighed 2 pounds per man, more food in one meal than his unit had received in 3 days at Kasserine Pass. The Americans served it on actual plates, with metal forks and knives. When Richter couldn't finish, he tried to hide the bread in his shirt, certain this abundance was temporary, perhaps a propaganda show. The American guard who caught him just laughed and pointed to the sign, "Take all you want, eat all you take." 371 camps across America, 425,000 German prisoners by war's end. The numbers alone tell one story, but the lived experience tells another. Major John Mason, commandant at Camp Opelika, received shipments that would have seemed fantasy to his prisoners' families back home: 50,000 pounds of beef monthly, 30,000 loaves of bread, vegetables by the truckload. The camp's single ice cream machine, yes, ice cream machine, could produce 40 gallons daily. On Sundays it did. German prisoners would stand in line for vanilla ice cream in the Alabama heat, writing home about this impossibility, while their families in Hamburg and Berlin scraped mold off their black bread rations. The revelation came in stages. First the food, then the scale. Prisoners arriving at camps from New York to Nebraska saw freight trains miles long, packed with war material. They saw highways filled with civilian automobiles. Civilians still had cars, still had gasoline. They saw factories running 3 shifts, producing aircraft at rates that defied comprehension. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, the camp newspaper, edited by prisoners, another impossibility, reported that prisoners could see the Douglas aircraft plant from their barracks. 24-hour production, a bomber every 63 minutes. Oberleutnant Friedrich Becker had commanded a Luftwaffe squadron. He knew Germany's peak production, 300 aircraft monthly, all types combined. The Americans built that many in 5 days, in one plant. The prisoners did the math obsessively. Letters home, preserved in archives, show the calculations. If one camp of 3,000 men received 50,000 pounds of meat monthly, and there were 300 camps, and this was just for prisoners, then American meat production must be. The numbers broke their conception of possibility. Wehrmacht intelligence had told them America was a mongrel nation, weak, undisciplined, crippled by the Depression. Jazz music and democracy had made them soft. German racial superiority and discipline would triumph over American material advantage. But here was Unteroffizier Dorsch drinking Coca-Cola in Alabama, while his brother in Bavaria made coffee from acorns. The transformation started with disbelief, moved through shame, and ended in something unexpected. Feldwebel Kurt Muller, imprisoned at Camp Stark, New Hampshire, wrote in his diary, Americans allowed prisoners to keep diaries, about the day he truly understood. October 1943. The guards had organized a baseball game, prisoners versus guards. Halfway through, it started raining. The Americans called it off. Everyone ran for shelter, and Muller found himself under an awning with Sergeant Jim Thompson from Iowa. Thompson offered him a cigarette. Lucky strike, not the compressed tobacco and sawdust German soldiers smoked. They stood there, Nazi and farm boy, smoking in the rain. Thompson started talking about his family's farm. 600 acres, 38 cows, 2 tractors, a telephone, electric lights. Muller had grown up on a farm in Pomerania. 12 acres, 1 horse, kerosene lamps, no telephone in the entire village. Thompson wasn't wealthy by American standards. He was ordinary. That's when Muller understood that everything he'd been told about America was a lie. The camps became universities of cognitive dissonance. At Camp Hearn, Texas, prisoners could take courses through local colleges. At Camp Campbell, Kentucky, they staged Shakespearean plays with costumes made by the prisoners themselves from materials the Americans provided. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, prisoners operated their own bakery, producing fresh bread for the entire camp plus extra for local hospitals. The Geneva Convention required America to treat prisoners no worse than their own soldiers. America interpreted this generously. German prisoners ate better than they had as frontline troops. They gained weight. Many gained 20, 30 pounds. Their families, receiving photographs through the Red Cross, couldn't understand how men looked healthier in captivity than they'd looked in uniform. Some prisoners found work on local farms. The labor shortage meant Americans needed help with harvests. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffman picked cotton in Mississippi in September 1944. The farmer, James Crawford, paid him 80 cents a day. Not much, but prisoners could buy items from camp canteens. Coca-Cola, candy bars, cigarettes, writing paper. Crawford ate lunch with his German prisoners, the same table. His wife served them iced tea. Hoffman had been taught that Americans lynched inferior races, that segregation proved American hypocrisy. Yet here he was, a prisoner, an enemy, drinking sweet tea on a porch in Mississippi while Crawford complained about government crop prices. Just 2 men talking about farming. Crawford's son was fighting in Italy. He might be shooting at Hoffman's brother. They both knew it. They talked about soil conditions instead. The most powerful revelations came through mundane interactions. At Camp Robinson, Arkansas, Hauptgefreiter Werner Steinhaus worked in the camp hospital. One evening, an American nurse, Lieutenant Mary Patterson, asked him to help with inventory. They counted bandages, medicines, surgical supplies. The quantities staggered him. More morphine in one camp hospital than in an entire German field hospital. Sulfa drugs by the case. Penicillin, the wonder drug Germany couldn't produce. Patterson mentioned casually that every American camp had similar supplies. Every field hospital, every aid station. Steinhaus had watched German soldiers die from infections that these medicines could cure. He'd seen men bite leather straps during amputations without anesthesia. Here, enemy prisoners received better medical care than German officers. That night, he wrote in his journal, "We never had a chance. We were fighting the future with the past." The numbers accumulated into absurdity. America produced 200,000 aircraft during the war, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 600,000 jeeps, 2.5 million trucks. 16 million Americans served in uniform while the nation still produced consumer goods, still made Coca-Cola, still played baseball, still published hundreds of newspapers that criticized the government freely. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Kessler, the senior German officer at Camp Livingston, Louisiana, read American newspapers daily. They reported American losses honestly. They published letters criticizing Roosevelt, criticizing the war, criticizing the treatment of prisoners as too generous. No one was arrested. No editors disappeared. The papers just kept publishing. In Nazi Germany, a joke about Hitler meant death. In America, comedians mocked the president on the radio. The most devastating revelation came through the camp newspapers. By 1944, many camps published their own papers, written and edited by prisoners. Der Ruf at Fort Kearney, POWWII at Camp Ellis. The Americans provided printing equipment, paper, even helped with distribution. These papers could receive international news through wire services. German prisoners read about Hamburg firebombed, 40,000 dead. Dresden incinerated, 25,000 dead. Berlin surrounded. Cologne in ruins. The Rhine crossed. They read it eating eggs and bacon, drinking real coffee, in camps where the greatest hardship was boredom. They read about their families hiding in basements while they played soccer on manicured fields. Stabsgefreiter Ernst Wagner arrived at Camp Aliceville, Alabama in March 1944. Captured in Italy, he'd fought since Poland 1939. 5 years of war. He'd seen Warsaw burn, France fall, Russia bleed. He believed in the cause, the racial destiny, the 1,000-year Reich. His first morning in Alabama, he watched American guards throw away more food after breakfast than his unit had seen in a week on the Gothic line. Full strips of bacon, whole eggs, toast barely touched, into garbage cans. He stood there, this veteran of 5 years of victories, watching Americans casually discard abundance, and something broke inside him. He'd fought for a lie. They all had. The realization spread through conversations in barracks, discussions that would have meant execution in Germany. At Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, Hauptmann Otto Steinberg gave lectures on American industrial capacity. He'd been a factory manager before the war. He understood production. Using information gleaned from American newspapers and magazines provided by the Americans, he calculated that American war production exceeded Germany's by a factor of 12, not percentage points, times 12, and this while maintaining civilian production. Germany had enslaved millions, looted continents, and still couldn't match what America produced with paid workers getting overtime. Some prisoners resisted the evidence. Nazi true believers organized resistance in camps, threatened fellow prisoners who questioned ideology. At Camp Papago Park, Arizona, hardliners murdered a prisoner they considered a traitor for suggesting Germany had lost. But they were swimming against a tide of Coca-Cola and ice cream, white bread and baseball, newspapers that told the truth, and guards who shared cigarettes. The very existence of abundance in captivity undermined everything they'd been taught about racial superiority, about strong defeating weak, about destiny and will. Christmas 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee. The American commander authorized a full German Christmas celebration. Prisoners decorated trees. The Americans provided trees, with handmade ornaments. The kitchen prepared traditional German dishes from recipes the prisoners provided, using ingredients that hadn't been available in Germany for 3 years. Roast goose, real potatoes, not turnips, actual coffee, stolen cake with real raisins and almonds. Obergefreiter Johann Schmidt, 22 years old, veteran of Stalingrad, sat at a table with 8 other prisoners eating Christmas dinner and crying. Not from sadness, from the absurdity. His mother in destroyed Cologne was probably eating turnip soup if she was lucky, if she was alive, while he, a prisoner of the enemy, ate like it was 1938 again. The Geneva Convention required repatriation after the war ended, but something unexpected happened. Thousands of German prisoners didn't want to leave. They petitioned to stay. Some had nothing to return to. Families dead, cities destroyed. Others had tasted something beyond material abundance. Feldwebel Müller, who'd shared that cigarette in New Hampshire rain, applied for immigration. So did Unteroffizier Dorsch, the man stunned by Coca-Cola. Gefreiter Hoffman, who'd picked cotton in Mississippi. Hundreds of others. They'd seen a society that functioned differently, where abundance was normal, not miraculous, where disagreement didn't mean death, where enemies could become neighbors. The American military surveyed 20,000 German prisoners in 1945, asking about their experiences. 74% rated their treatment as excellent or very good. 61% said their opinion of America had completely changed. 56% said they'd learned more about democracy in camps than in their entire previous lives. These weren't propaganda numbers. These were anonymous surveys, conducted as prisoners prepared for repatriation. They had no reason to lie. One survey response from an unnamed Luftwaffe pilot at Camp McCain, Mississippi, captured the transformation. I arrived believing I was racially superior to mongrel Americans. I leave knowing I was spiritually inferior to free men. You defeated us not with hatred, but with ice cream, not with propaganda, but with abundance, not with lies, but with baseball. We told ourselves we were warriors. You showed us we were fools. By spring 1946, most prisoners had been repatriated. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, dependent on American food aid to avoid starvation. The Marshall Plan would come next, rebuilding what war had destroyed. But for 400,000 German prisoners, American generosity wasn't abstract policy. It was Coca-Cola in Alabama heat, ice cream on Sundays, white bread when black bread would have sufficed, baseball games with guards, college courses in Texas, Christmas dinner in Tennessee. They'd learned that American strength came not from racial superiority or mystical destiny, but from a system that could produce abundance while treating enemies as humans. Major John Mason, retiring from Camp Opelika in 1946, gave a final interview to the local newspaper. Asked about his experience commanding a prisoner camp, He said something remarkable for a man who'd lost friends in the war. "We didn't just capture their bodies. By treating them better than their own country did, we captured their minds. Every German who ate ice cream in Alabama, who drank Coca-Cola in the heat, who gained weight while his family starved, he became a walking refutation of everything Hitler told them. We won the war with bombs. We won the peace with abundance." The numbers remain staggering. 425,000 prisoners, 371 camps, 50 million pounds of meat monthly across all camps, uncounted gallons of ice cream, millions of Coca-Colas, tons of white bread, baseball games beyond counting, Christmas dinners that would have seemed impossible in wartime Germany, college courses for enemies, newspapers that told the truth, guards who shared cigarettes, a nation that turned warrior enemies into future immigrants through the simple, devastating power of plenty.